Welcome back to the end of a series of 3 videos that I've done. So the first one we talked about carbohydrates, so if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen. The second one we talked about fructose, and this one we're going to talk about wheat. Now what's interesting about wheat, it is number 1, a carbohydrate, but number 2, it has fructans in it, which is a series of fructoses strung together within the wheat. But that's not necessarily why I'm going to talk to you about wheat, but I just want you to know that this is how it all joins in and why we may be having a problem with wheat. So last week we talked about FODMAPs and we talked about fructose malabsorption, and when you go on FODMAPs you take wheat out of the diet. But I think there is an overarching problem with wheat. So remember in the first video I talked about the fact that the way I ate, my mum made her own bread. We always had sandwiches for lunch. We had cakes and cookies, and I ate vanilla slices and chocolate eclairs, everything with wheat. Never had a wheat problem. It wasn't until I reached my 50s, and I was probably about 51, 52, that I started to get aches and pains. I wasn't feeling good. I was getting a tight throat. My hair wasn't growing. It was frizzy. My skin was dry. What else did I have? I was starting to gain weight. I was still eating the same foods that I've always eaten, but I started to gain weight. And for me, I know that it's food, because I'm a nutritionist. When you got a hammer, you just keep banging that nail. And so for me, it was food. So I went, right, something I'm eating, got to figure it out. Went on an elimination diet. Eliminated everything from the diet except basically meat and veg and a couple of pieces of fruit, and they were usually apple, citrus, like some winter fruits, not much more, and some berries. So in 1 week I lost 4.5 kilos. So losing 4.5 kilos in 1 week is not fat, that's inflammation. I also lost all my pain. All my aches just disappeared. The tightness in my throat disappeared. I'd had a sore back for probably 18 months. My husband's a chiropractor. We couldn't figure out what was happening. My right hip was getting so painful when I'd been sitting and then got up that I thought, oh my goodness, am I going to need a hip replacement? So this is where I was going. So I eliminated everything but those few foods that I talked about. And then basically, within 1 week, it all disappeared. And then over the next 2 weeks, I ended up losing around 9 kilos, slowly every day. You usually lose between 250, 300 grams a day if you reduce your calories and you do like a semi-fasting diet, which is basically what I did. Felt fantastic. Got to tell you, about 2 weeks into the program, my brain clicked in. I didn't realize how foggy my brain was. I had unbelievable clarity of mind, so much so that I called a girlfriend. And I just said, I'm driving down the mountain at the moment and I just feel joy. I feel one, and I know this sounds like I'm on drugs, but I'm not. I feel one with nature. I feel and see with so much clarity. It's quite incredible. And she had a giggle with me, and we always have a giggle about it. But I did. I felt amazing. So then I started to introduce the foods back into the diet. And as I introduced, I was doing great. No weight was being put on. I wasn't inflamed. No pain was coming back until I put wheat into the diet. And the very next day, I put on nearly 1 kilo of weight, which is water. I can't be fat. It was water. My sore back came back. My sore hip came back. And my question was this: why is wheat my problem? I've been eating wheat for 50 years without it really being a serious problem. I understand the anthropology of wheat and the agricultural revolution. So why did wheat become this issue? So I went on a huge research binge, and the final straw, I believe, as I was researching it, was the new agricultural practice. So Roundup, which is like you hear of Roundup Ready GMOs. Well, wheat is not a genetically modified grain as yet, but wheat, before they seed, they put Roundup on the land to get rid of any weeds. So there's already Roundup on the land, and Roundup, by the way, is a herbicide. It's also a patented antibiotic and a patented chelating agent. So it basically strips the land of minerals, it strips the land of the microbes, and doesn't allow the nutrition to come into the plant the way it would normally do if it wasn't stripped of these things. So number one, our plants are weaker. Number two, they'll need to put pesticides on because more pests will probably be attracted to that grain. Then, if not all farmers do this, but it's becoming a practice, and it's a practice since about the year 2000, is that they want to dry and ripen the crop together. So what they do is they spray it with Roundup a couple of weeks before harvest, and then they harvest the wheat, and that wheat goes into a silo. So maybe one farmer used the Roundup but the other one didn't, but you put that all in a silo and it all gets contaminated. Then we consume that Roundup or that glyphosate, which is the active ingredient. So whether they're using Roundup or Weed Master or whatever other name, in Australia there are 596 registered products with glyphosate in it. So we consume that, and then it's like consuming an antibiotic, and that starts to erode the microbiome. And in my last video I talked about the erosion of the microbiome and why we can't tolerate fructose anymore. And it's the same with wheat. Wheat has proteins in it that sometimes we don't digest. One is gluten, and everybody was saying that maybe gluten was the problem. Perhaps not gluten, but maybe glyphosate is the issue. So what glyphosate does is it opens up the epithelial lining that protects you from the food that you consume, the bacteria that's in the food, or any contaminants that are in the food. It protects you. But if you open that epithelial lining up, it allows undigested proteins, undigested foods to go into the blood. The blood creates an immune response, and what ends up happening is that you may get an allergy, you may get a food sensitivity, you may just become inflamed, autoimmune diseases may come about through molecular mimicry, and it's like this vicious cycle. And until you stop consuming the Roundup or the glyphosate, and until you stop consuming that wheat, then that problem will just perpetuate. So for me, I hit 60. I haven't eaten wheat in 8 years. If I do consume a little bit of wheat, I don't have that same issue. But I still remain away from it, even if it's organic. I've just made that decision that I'm better off without it, and I feel amazing. I feel like going into my 60s, I'm far better than when I ever did going into my 50s. It's worth it, I tell you. You might think, well, what about my bread and my croissants, and what about my sandwiches? But you see, it's like anything. Like, what do you want? Do you want pain or do you want health? And I wanted health, and I wanted energy, and I wanted to run with my grandchildren and keep up with my kids and do all those things, and remain somebody that had lots of energy and was able to do the things that she wanted to do, like tend her garden or her farm or write or all those wonderful things. So I hope you've enjoyed this series of 3. If you want to learn more about glyphosate and Roundup and wheat and what they've done to our wheat, can I recommend you watch my documentary, What's with Wheat? We'll put a link to that in the notes so that you know where you can go and watch it. All right, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.